that is, determined to just do everything quick and fast and without a lot of good thought. And it's causing so much damage. What do you think about, this shock and awe style that they have adopted here?
Well, this move fast and break things philosophy is breaking things, and it's hurting students and families. Last week, the free application for federal student aid, which is the access point to the federal financial aid system, went down. And when they called the folks who ordinarily would fix it, they didn't answer because they'd been laid off. And it took them longer than it should have to get it back up. But that system is vital to the nation's long-term economic success. About half of the students who come to SUNY, our freshmen, are Pell-eligible students. So if you can't get your Pell grants, if you can't get your student loans, that means students could potentially miss out on the opportunity to pursue higher education. So I'm very worried that their recklessness is going ultimately to undermine the American dream.
Wow. I was in a room. Yes, go ahead, Daryl. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Secretary, that you talked about undermining the American dream with education. And, I come from a family of educators. And one of the things that is interesting is that a lot of times people don't understand the profession of educating and all the technical pieces and substantive knowledge that goes into that, and practical pieces. So when I look at what's happening now with the Department of Education, I see a president that doesn't have a background in education. I see, Elon Musk that doesn't have a background in education, and I see a Secretary of Education that doesn't have a background of education. Work with me here. So if they don't have any of the education experience, how are they going to dismantle this and put out a good product that can turn out good, strong, thinking, analytical students?
You're exactly right. Look, part of the tragedy here, when I think about the people who are laid off, so many of them were former teachers, former principals, former student affairs professionals from higher ed campuses, people who've given their whole lives to education, who have decades of institutional memory and incredible technical expertise. And they just got rid of all those folks. And as I said, you're already seeing the consequences. And the message it sends to educators around the country is, we just don't care about you. And that to me is heartbreaking.
And one thing people don't know about the Department of Education, unless you have a child who is who needs special assistance, special education, or who has a learning disability, that people don't understand that all of that assistance, all of the assistance for low-income schools, the Title I assistance, all of that is administered through the Department of Education. In the olden times, prior to 1979 and the creation of the Department of Education, those students just sat in the back of the class, were ignored, or people didn't even bother to put them on a bus to even take them to school because they were so undereducated, so ignored, so neglected within the process. But it seems that we're returning to that. Is that correct? Under this new administration?
Exactly right. You're exactly right. This is about reversing civil rights gains. Right. At the end of the day, the Education Department is a civil rights agency. Its charge is to protect vulnerable students. Last year, the department got over 20,000 complaints about discriminatory actions by states, school districts, higher ed institutions. And they've laid off the very people whose job is to investigate those complaints and bring them to resolution. And so if you're a parent and your child is not getting the services that they're entitled to because of their disability, you're going to have to wait much, much longer to get any intervention, if ever any intervention. If your a civil rights activist in a local community and you see that Black and Latino students are systematically excluded from advanced placement classes, you're not going to get a response when you file that complaint with the education department because they've laid off the people who do that work.
My. So, Daryl,
it's part of the thinking, Mr. Secretary, that if they remove some of this responsibility from the federal government is to shift it then to the state departments of education. But what happens to the state departments of education that are like in Louisiana, the poorer states, that are in Mississippi, that are in Alabama? You know, if they choose not to do any of the investigations in the OCR complaints, you know, if they don't have the money to have the investigations done, if they don't have the money to implement the individual education programs or the 504s, what then?
You're exactly right. And look, people are forgetting the history here, right? You know, I always remind folks, if you think of that painting of Ruby Bridges integrating schools in New Orleans, you know, the famous Norman Rockwell painting, she is escorted by federal marshals. Why? Because the federal government had to intervene. The state and district didn't want to serve her, didn't want to provide African-American students with an equitable education, and the federal government had to intervene. And that's the history of the federal role, whether we're talking about race or disability or gender. I mean, think about how Title IX enforcement has transformed the landscape of women's participation in sports. Right? That wouldn't have been possible but for robust federal implementation of civil rights law. And so, I fear the agenda here is really to take us backward, and we need folks to organize, parents, students, community leaders, and we need to remind particularly members of Congress about that history and what an important federal role there is in education.
Yes, and I believe, Daryl, let's check. Have we been joined by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw? Mr. Engineer? Okay. All right. When she does join, please let us know, sir. And let us move on, because the point you just made is so important about, knowing that history and respecting it and looking at this, because I got to give a shout out right now, a big shout out, folks, to Coach Dawn Staley. Is that the way you say her name, Daryl?
Yeah, Dawn Staley, absolutely.
Yeah, because she was approached by Elon Musk, who said, "I'll give you $10 million for your group, for your students, and for your program." And she did something nobody would have thought. She said, "No, I don't want it." She says, "I want you to give that money to the people who need it, to the poor, to the hungry, to those who are unhoused, to schools. I want you to give that money where it's needed." That is so unusual, but that is so important, that when you're up against an administration that rather do, pony dog and pony shows than, be serious. I will never get over the imagery of his converting the East Room into a fake schoolhouse and having the very children he's going to hurt sitting there, as his big, image. And that was horrific. It was, ugly. It was so using. But that's the world we're in, and it takes the Dawn Staleys and others to stand up. Did I just hear that Ms. Crenshaw has joined us? Tanya Clay House. Okay. All righty. Thank you. Hey, Tanya. Welcome to Igniting Change.
Hi, Barbara. How are you?
Fine. I guess this means that Kim is not going to be able to join us, but that you, of course, are standing in her stead, so she's well represented.
Yeah. Unfortunately, she got stuck in an appointment hopefully she might be able to still call in, so I'm not going to say no. But I wanted to make sure that we called in at the time that you had requested. So I'm the stand-in for right now, I know. But I'm not Dr.
No. Well, Tanya, I'm sorry we didn't know you were coming because we would have, so that we would be prepared to introduce you appropriately. But I know, of course, that you have an incredible civil rights background because you work with me at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights on the Law, that you also have a great knowledge of Congress because you worked on the Hill. You also worked at the Department of Education under Obama. Tell people about the role that you held there.
Sure. Well, I'm actually, it was exciting to hear Secretary King because he was my boss.
Yes.
Glad to be reunited with you.
Hi, John.
Hello. It's good to hear your voice.
Yes, you too. I loved our partnership. It was terrific.
I love it.
He was my boss, and I'm looking at his picture, my picture with him right here, and I'm also looking at the picture that the Secretary referred to, Ruby Bridges, because it actually sits above my desk. I look at it every day. Yeah. That is what is my inspiration. That's what I go to. So, yeah, I was Deputy Assistant Secretary under both started first, actually, before John, and then John came in right after I came in. And so it was exciting to be there. We did a lot of good work, and so did that, and was also, as you mentioned, worked on the Hill beforehand with both in the House and the Senate, and worked with you, I in many other capacities. So it's been a ride. Let me just tell you.
Right, and you currently consult and work regularly with the African American Policy Forum.
Correct. I'm the senior strategist there. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and you work with Kairos and with and so many other great groups. Listen, and you're also, and we missed you so much last week in Iowa.
I'm sorry,
Chair of the Civil Rights Section for the National Bar Association. Which is powerful.
I couldn't be two places at once. We had a strategic meeting going on, and I was trying to figure out how to split between, but it wasn't going to work.
We can't do that. We haven't succeeded, none of us, in those clones. So my question to you and to to Chancellor King is, you have referred, both of you have referred to the Ruby Bridges picture. And it's quite telling, isn't it, that the books that tell the story of Ruby Bridges and her integration of those schools are actually banned. They're banned in many school districts. When you think about that, Chancellor King, what does that mean about education when you're trying to erase whole histories? No Jackie Robinson, no Enola Gay, no reference to Tuskegee Airmen. All of these horrible attempted historical erasures of Black history. What does that mean?
It's horrifying, and I think part of this is a broader agenda to just take us back before so much of the progress of the civil rights era. One way you do that is you dismantle civil rights enforcement capacity. Another way you do that is you erase the history and you try to make it so that young people, regardless of their race, that young people don't recognize the truth about our history. I started out as a high school social studies teacher. The job is to make sure students understand how we got here. And that means the hard parts and the good parts. But when you leave that out, you leave students confused about how we got to the place where we are, and it makes them more susceptible to being misled. And that's the real fear here.
Wow. And Tanya, we saw that, right? We saw that in the polling that APF did,